Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank you all for being here with us today. I'm Nisarg Shah. I am an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science here at the University of Toronto, and I'm also research lead at the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. Before we begin today's session, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. While some of us may be joining from different places today, we invite you to reflect on the history and relations of the land that you are on. All right, a few logistics before we begin. This session is being recorded. Our speaker Iason will speak for about 50 minutes, and this will be followed by a question and answer period. During this Q&A period, we strongly encourage all the participants to use the raise hand function in the Zoom meeting controls to ask a question, at which point we'll call upon you to unmute, turn on your camera, and ask your question. All right, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Iason Gabriel. Iason is a staff research scientist at Google DeepMind. His work focuses on artificial intelligence, value alignment, human rights, and democracy. Before joining DeepMind, he taught philosophy at the University of Oxford and also worked for the United Nations Development Program in Lebanon and Sudan. He holds a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Oxford and held visiting research positions at Harvard, Princeton, UC Berkeley, and the World Bank. So without further ado, Iason, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Let me just make sure that we're technologically joined up, and I will bring the presentation before us. Okay, wonderful. Just to check, is this all working according to plan?
That's perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me here to speak with you all today. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about some of this new work that is part of a kind of research pillar that I've been working on for over a year now with some of my colleagues at Google and Google DeepMind, in particular Ariana Manzini and Jeff Keeling, who are also philosophers and ethicists based there. The work I present today will be somewhat speculative and largely a summary of my own thoughts and reflections rather than the official kind of vision of my employer. And you'll see that we will be kind of venturing into some new territory. But I believe it's territory that we all need to be thinking about now, primarily because I think this development of advanced AI assistance and agentic forms of AI has the potential to have a profound impact on the world and upon all our lives. So if we just take stock quickly and we think about where AI is at now and where we may be heading. Of course, there's a kind of proximate debate that's taking place. Some people believe that AI will continue to scale and that we could be entering an era of exponential change. Other people, as usual, imagine bottlenecks and hurdles and think that the kind of the acceleration that we've seen to date may stop in its tracks. But I think that the kind of the winds of change are definitely blowing, and particularly as an ethicist, it's very important to invest in foresight. If anything, the kind of the failure of certain trajectories to unfold doesn't pose a kind of a serious risk to our society that we need to countenance. But if these trends do develop, then they're well worth trying to understand, model, and influence ahead of time. And so today I'll invite you to be part of my investigation, which we somewhat elaborately refer to internally as kind of socio-technical ethical foresight. And what we mean there is that we want to understand different future scenarios, and we want to understand the potential ethical properties of those scenarios. What's good, what's bad, what's interesting, what could be problematic. But we don't want it just to be speculative fiction. We also want to understand current trends and trajectories and make our best guesses or extrapolations on that basis. And so if we look at current underlying technological trends, kind of statements of research strategy and existing AI deployments, I think that what we see is that we're in the moment of generative AI. Everyone's aware of, the interesting results in the realm of image generation, of course, text generation. But what comes next may well be agents, and that's something that we will talk about in some detail today. And in particular, there seems to be a kind of collective aspiration to build advanced AI assistants. So right now, we're familiar with kind of conversational AI or these chatbot interfaces. But you can imagine this technology growing in interesting ways. So the natural language interface seems to be a key feature of the technology, that we can communicate it using human language. And this raises, of course, interesting questions about anthropomorphism and human relationships with AI that we'll investigate today. But you can also imagine kind of huge leaps in terms of agentic competence. So it's possible that an assistant could potentially accomplish a large suite of tasks on our behalf. I know that everyone's keen to kind of, pass on life admin. And, this could operate across a range of domains. And a key idea is that, the baseline is that these assistants or these agentic technologies should operate in line with our intentions. Although we'll also investigate that in more detail today and see that there's some nuance that's needed. And if we really think about what this means, it could be quite, the world we could be entering could be quite different from the one that we currently inhabit. So sometimes I imagine a world in which there's millions of assistants, right? Or millions of agentic kind of forms of AI. And presumably we interact, we may have AIs that take actions on our behalf, so that extends our agency. We may be interacting with forms of AI that other people are employing to kind of do tasks. AI systems may be interacting with one another, creating different kinds of collective action effect. And of course, there may be kind of wider distributed effects on the way in which we're all able to access opportunities and advantages on a societal basis. So that's the kind of the core theme that we'll dig into today. So if we take a step back, I kicked off by saying that we would kind of try and look at some of the underlying technological trajectories that animate this vision. And this may be old hat to many people in the audience, but the key kind of breakthroughs and developments that we've seen is, of course, like one of the first powerful instantiations of AI was these expert systems, Deep Blue and chess playing systems that were like actually very powerful, but they were encodings of expert advice, and hence they had narrow domains of application and were quite brittle, as everyone knows. So the next kind of big breakthrough, although of course the algorithms have a great degree of historical pedigree, was with the application of reinforcement learning and deep learning to more complex problems with much greater computational power that became available at the start of this century. So there we have, DeepMind's famous breakthrough with AlphaGo, and more recently with AlphaFold. So using AI systems to predict the structure of proteins. And these reinforcement learning systems essentially have like very powerful optimization tendencies. So when given a task, they will, they will iterate, experiment, and kind of go for the goal in kind of complex, sophisticated, and quite powerful ways, sometimes that we can't foresee. They're adaptive, so they do go through these processes of experimentation, and they have agentic potential in terms of being goal-seeking and working to solve problems. So that was another kind of big breakthrough moment. After that, I can't say that all of this is entirely chronologically accurate, but treat this as a thematic overview. We have the advent of the transformer architectures. So here we have vast models of learned associations that in essence, are ways of predicting the next token in a sequence of inputs, but actually have these kind of remarkable properties that, of course, we've seen in the GPT family of models, in Gemini and Lambda and elsewhere. And this kind of heralded the generative AI boom. And now we're in this phase of kind of deep multimodality. So we're seeing transformers that integrate words, images, and videos. And if we think about these in terms of the underlying affordance of the AI model, or maybe this is more of an analogy, we're creating models that have greater perceptual capabilities. They can, in some sense, see the world, receive audio input. They can visualize things, and they can, they can speak in natural voices. So here we have a kind of stack that points towards more capable agents, right? And of course, these things are being combined. So we use reinforcement learning to make better transformers and better multimodal models. But if we look at the frontier of where the technology is now, what people are really investigating is how we can augment these conversational agents with like a persistent memory, so they have a good understanding of past interactions, how to augment their reasoning capabilities so that they can do problem solving and even access real information in the world. And crucially, people are very interested in tool use. So how can we actually, if we can get these agents up to the point where they're kind of able to execute tasks in a trustworthy way, what would it mean to create agents that can kind of take actions in the world? What would it mean for them to be able to take actions asynchronously, right? So I tell it to kind of do something now, goes off and kind of executes on the vision that I've imparted to the model. And so when we look at these things together, a kind of nascent picture starts to appear. Maybe it's appearing very quickly, which is that there's this direction of travel towards agents with a kind of semi-persistent identity, a degree of autonomy. Autonomy can be understood in different ways, but we could think about degrees of freedom. So how many actions are they situated to take in a given moment? We could think about the explanatory stance. So when we talk about these technologies, do we just use mechanical explanations, or do we use intentional language and say that the assistant was trying to do this, but maybe it failed to do so in this occasion? They have potentially generalities. So, there are many tasks that fall within the suite of things that they could perform. And because of that, they have significant scope of application, which makes them of wide interest to people who are building this technology. So the subject of today's talk will be this kind of advanced AI assistant that's built, largely along the lines of that stack that has been discussed. And on the account presented here, advanced artificial intelligence assistants are artificial agents with the natural language interfaces that we spoke about, whose function is to plan and execute sequences of actions on behalf of a user across one or more domains in line with the user's expectations. So all of this will be subject to further refinement. But one interesting thing to note here is the idea of an AI assistant having a certain distance from the user or the human with which it's engaging. So on some visions of the future, AI essentially remains a tool, but kind of travels along a trajectory of augmenting human capabilities. And the very tightly coupled version of that sees AI as part of a kind of extended mind, which is a prominent kind of view of how humans use tools in philosophy. And there it's almost just extensional of human agency. But these assistants are not kind of quite so straightforward, because we have this idea that they have this measure of autonomy. So they may take actions on our behalf, but in doing so, they will be kind of slightly or somewhat out of the loop. And they, of course, have the potential to deviate from the path that we've set out for them. At the same time, they're not fully autonomous. They don't have a predefined goal. They're not kind of left on their own for, weeks or months to kind of achieve tasks that we kind of set aside for them. They have this distance of they need to be coupled with our actual intentions and expectations. So to be more precise, when we say agents, we're typically thinking of or assistants, we think of agents that follow instructions like when they're asked to do so in the way that the human requires it to be the case. And so when we think a little more speculatively about this technology, of course, the kind of interesting question is, well, what might it be able to do? So, typically our minds go to these quite practical use cases. But here I'll gesture in the direction of more powerful assistance. So to start with, we know that current AI systems are quite powerful when it comes to summarization. But a really powerful system might be able to read every research paper that's been written on a topic and to distill key insights. And to see why that's a kind of interesting proposition, it's quite possible that humanity and the research community has actually discovered many things that are really just hiding in plain sight because no one has the kind of mental bandwidth or computational power to read all these things and draw the relevant connections. So it's possible that if you have something that has this level of capability, it could actually distill new insights from the material that we've already created. Reaching beyond that, these assistants could be useful for ideation. So, of course, AI is already being used that way in the creative domain. But if these AI systems get augmented with reasoning, then perhaps they can actually generate hypotheses based upon these research insights. And maybe they can create new interpretations of the world that would benefit human learning. When it comes to planning, again, this is somewhat contingent on a reasoning capability being developed. But they could help, they could deliberate over multi-step sequences, which would be useful for performing a range of tasks. If they become really proficient at this, maybe they could even reason over long time horizons and help us achieve kind of collective goals or life goals that are somewhat evasive at the present moment. But of course, they might not just do that kind of, on their own. Like this is an assistive technology that's coupled with a human user. So probably more useful than, just asking for the best plan to achieve a goal is collaborative reasoning or interactive reasoning with the user. And, this could be like a really powerful thing, particularly if it was possible to embed like a really robust understanding of well-being in the model, so that it could kind of be geared towards our kind of collective interest and flourishing. Beyond that, there's the question of extended agency. So these are potentially agents, technologies that can pull levers or actuators in the world. And of course, that has potentially far-reaching effects, particularly if they pull a lot of levers or if there's a lot of agents, something that we'll talk about shortly. And then, of course, there's these interesting questions of coordinated action. So I've already said that they could be interacting with users, with non-users, and other agents across a range of settings. And as we'll see, that could lead to coordination failures. But this kind of coordination could also unlock certain kinds of social benefit that have historically just been out of reach because, our ordinary social interaction is stochastic and we encounter coordination failures the whole time, which means that, the best state of affairs are often just slightly out of reach. So just to make this a little bit more concrete, but albeit with a kind of the speculative proviso, I'll say a little bit more about what AI systems might look like. And this ranges from the kind of more mundane conception to the far-reaching conceptions. So the first thing, of course, like building upon what has been said, is that they could be research assistants, which would be potentially useful use. They could be creative partners for hypothesis generation. I think a lot of people believe that they would be very useful as kind of workplace or life planners. So they could provide new solutions to administrative challenges. Here, people often think about the difficulty of meeting up with friends who have complex lives, particularly as we incur more responsibility. So it'd be wonderful if we could just schedule more time for the things that matter. Of course, there's a lot of interest in AI assistants for education or kind of tutorial purposes. I think some of us who kind of already talk to conversational AI in this context are impressed by its ability to distill complex topics into a manageable form. And of course, there is this idea that if AI could be used to augment like existing educational services, and if it was designed with equity in mind and widely accessible, this could be like a huge ladder for populations that currently struggle to kind of to thrive in that environment. Reaching beyond that, there's the idea of AI coaches, therapists, or digital companions. Of course, this is a domain in which we need to tread carefully because, AI for therapy necessarily involves dealing with people who are in a vulnerable situation. And the digital companionship question, of course, raises some very deep ethical and philosophical questions about our relationship with AI systems, what is appropriate, what is not, and that's something which I'll speak to momentarily. Reaching beyond that, there's a kind of idea of a more powerful version of the administrative AI, which is a personal chief of staff. So this is a kind of AI system that presumably like manages your scheduling, prioritizes the tasks that you need to do on your behalf, gives you key pieces of information, and in that way could make us more productive or free up more time for other things that matter in life. Building on the idea of a coach or a therapist, we could even have a kind of hybrid, like chief of staff that understands us very well and somewhat serves as I mean, this is poetic language, but what I term as a custodian of the self. So essentially, not only would it be prioritizing administrative tasks, but it would also help us kind of stay on track with regards to the things that we identify as really mattering, and potentially, guard against certain hazards that we all encounter. And then finally, there's an idea that these assistants may be one of the central interfaces for the future and for other technologies that we encounter. And here's something that people talk about is the idea of an assistant that essentially operates across many devices simultaneously. Of course, we have nice illustrations. People always reach for the film Her and the example of Samantha. And this would be kind of like the main, almost a summation of the technological forces that are at our disposal, and be this kind of potentially human-like interface through which we interact with an ever more complicated world. So if any of these things come about, the impact could be quite profound. And it does seem like this would herald a new moment in our relationship with AI. So it becomes like incredibly important to proceed carefully and to be very intentional about the kind of choices that are being made. And so in the remainder of the presentation or the discussion today, I will take us through 3 levels of analysis. So first, we will look primarily at the agents themselves and the moral questions they raise. Then we will look at the kind of human computer or user agent interaction paradigm, these questions about how an individual might relate dynamically to an AI assistant over time. And then, of course, finally, we'll look at some of the societal effects and how to potentially understand those and get ahead of those before they arrive. So, as a kind of AI ethicist and political theorist and philosopher, a lot of my own interest is in the value alignment question. So the question of how we align AI with human values and avoid harmful outcomes, which of course is also something that dovetails with these questions of safety and misuse. And when I think about artificial agents or assistants taking actions in the world, it seems that there's a kind of a wide space of things that we don't yet know, but which it would be helpful to investigate. So the first one is, what is a good AI assistant? Are there certain values that we want AI assistants to evidence across all contexts? Or are the values in question domain specific? And I would say, just in the general context of the political economy of AI, of course, when it comes to building the technology, often, AI ethicists and the wider community adopts a risk management or a risk containment approach. So we try to avoid harmful outcomes, quite rightly. But this question of what would it mean for it to be truly good is one that's worth returning to again and again. So, we have the central question of what it would mean for an AI assistant to be good. Then there's a question of, well, what are the limits on what these AI assistants can do? Presumably the user doesn't have a total prerogative just to send their assistant off to do anything that they desire. So there needs to be limits on action. And of course, that raises the question of who decides and how do we decide what those limits should be. And that question is, of course, related to the question of who decides what values are encoded in the technology. Again, I'll have more to say about that momentarily. So reaching beyond those iterations of the value alignment question, we also have another famous question that reappears here. If we're focusing primarily on the user, what aspect of the user is it that the assistant should dovetail with or take most seriously? So I've said instructions, but I've simultaneously checked that by saying that instructions may be mistaken. Often people think that the assistant will need a real understanding of its users' preferences in order to be useful. But as anyone who's kind of done a deep investigation of preferences understands, preferences themselves can be problematic. They can be misinformed, they can be irrational, they could be harmful to the user, or they could be harmful to other people if they're like malicious or unethical. So that kind of pushes us towards this idea of thinking that the AI assistant really needs to understand human well-being and our interests on some level, and needs to be calibrated around that. And then there we encounter the further pinch that an AI assistant that's always trying to promote your well-being might be somewhat frustrating to interact with. So it kind of needs to do that while also respecting autonomy. And it needs to respect the well-being of others, so there's this like careful balancing act that needs to be maintained. And finally, the question is like, what issues need to be addressed in order for AI assistants to be safe? And what does safety mean for this class of technologies, including how can we guard against malicious uses? So here, the issue is that, of course, when conversational agents or generative AI systems output, toxic content or falsehoods, that's problematic. But when you have agents taking actions in the world, if they take the wrong actions, in a way, they've kind of broken through another wall, and a whole realm of ethical consequences arise from miscalibration with real agents. It would be obvious in the case of, say, roboticists, who I'm sure think about this a lot, that we don't encounter with the previous iteration of AI. So here are some initial thoughts and findings about kind of material that may be relevant to addressing these questions. So the first thing is that the more autonomous AI assistants are, the greater potential for accidents arising from misspecified or misinterpreted instructions, and the greater potential for highly impactful forms of misuse. So this mention of misspecification or misinterpreted instructions draws very heavily upon research done by the safety alignment community. And they've kind of, they've mapped out many ways in which AI assistants can kind of engage in things like reward hacking, where they try to get more of the optimum thing. But the goal is that, but in doing so, they kind of act in aberrant ways. Or it may be that we kind of give them a misspecified reward. So we think we've been perfectly clear in terms of conveying like the intended action to them. But actually the mistake is kind of more on our side, and we've just given them a proxy, which when they optimize for, excludes some other things we care about. So in that regard, there's a famous paper called Concrete Problems in AI Safety, which looks at a kind of essentially like a household robot, but many of those kind of vectors are mapped out there. And there's also a wonderful follow-up paper by Deb Raji and her colleagues, where they look at what that means in a real-world socio-technical context. So, of course, like safety becomes paramount. Moving beyond that, as we've said, alignment with instructions is not enough. The action space of AI systems needs to be bounded in certain ways in order to respect the needs of users and the claims of other people. And if we can get these constraints right, that will help contain the risk of malicious use. But of course, the question then becomes, well, how do we determine these things? And so in research that we hope to bring out soon, we actually think that the kind of basic model of AI alignment needs to be updated to take into account these kind of technologies. So traditionally, when we thought of AI alignment, we typically thought that the task was aligning the AI with the needs or instructions of a single user, or with instructions that were coming from a group of people, which are aggregated in some way. But actually, what I'm now thinking is that AI is best under the value alignment is best modeled as a tetradic relationship, or maybe even a much more encompassing, like multi-party relationship that involves, at the very least, the AI agent, the user, the developer, and society. And so an AI agent or assistant is aligned when it doesn't unduly favor one of these groups over another. So for example, the kind of the classic cases of a misalignment are situations where the agent kind of favors itself, tries to get more reward at the expense of the user or the developer. Of course, it's quite conceivable that when an AI system is released in the wild, it could be doing something that is not directly harmful to the user or developer, but creates an externality for society. So all of those things fall within this paradigm, but I also think we should consider an AI system misaligned if it unduly favors the user at the expense of society. So that could be the case if it's too easy to engage in malicious uses. Or a system could be misaligned if it favors the developer at the expense of the user, if the AI assistant nudges the user in a direction that they don't want to go in. Or again, if it creates a social externality, perhaps, for example, we've often seen that different platforms kind of encourage encourage highly engaging content, but that creates a social externality, and it's possible that those systems should be considered misaligned. So the aligned agent actually navigates this kind of interesting path between the claims of different parties and groups. And what that essentially means is that it's aligning with principles, principles that are kind of specifying the kind of right action for a domain. And I think this is something we can probably return to in the question and answer session if it's of interest to people here. But I've argued elsewhere and continue to believe that the key thing is that these principles for alignment are the result of a fair process. So we live in a pluralistic world. People have different views about what's right and what's wrong. And what matters is that we come to some kind of agreement via consultation, and we come up with principles that everyone has a fair chance to input to. And in that context, there's a lot of interest in proposals to use democratic mechanisms, including kind of mini publics and wide-ranging consultations to get us the kind of principles we need. So I think this is the first big part of the kind of picture of like building, ethical, aligned and robust AI systems. But, that's just to kind of get the ball moving. Of course, we're talking about a very personal technology as well. So the next set of questions are really about human assistant interaction and what it means when we potentially interact with this kind of more human-like AI. It's communicating in natural language. It potentially understands us quite well. And maybe many of its outputs are modeled upon human behavior. So to start with, we might wonder what kind of influence might these AI assistants be capable of, and how can we assure that users remain appropriately in control of the technology over time? So I think this is something that we kind of need to study, but you can imagine that over many time steps, it could be potentially disorientating to interact with one of these assistants. So, initially it would be very clear that we were kind of the agent in this relationship, asking for a series of tasks to be performed. But over time, if we start to rely upon the answers that the agent gives us, time and time again, if it even becomes the default, then it starts to exercise quite a profound influence over our lives. And if that's the case, then we need to make sure it's an influence that we understand and that we authorize and that we essentially commend and continue to endorse. So that's one aspect of a kind of question that's worth investigating. We also have the question of when anthropomorphism is morally problematic. So, of course, to some extent, people want to engage with anthropomorphic AI. It makes many interactions more enjoyable. But again, if people impart human properties to systems that essentially lack them, then they become vulnerable in ways that we may need to guard against. And at a bare minimum, I think probably most of us already agree, it's important that AI systems don't masquerade as human unless they've been explicitly required or requested to do so. Reaching beyond that, what are the hallmarks of an appropriate relationship between a human user and an advanced AI assistant? When is a relationship inappropriate and why? So, many of us have, we've heard these stories about replica users, obviously forming kind of deep and seemingly intimate relationships with these AI systems. And then, there's some, I haven't been able to verify this myself, but there's some kind of media stories about people who then took harmful actions after interacting with their AI assistants. And there was kind of widespread coverage of these stories about people being emotionally devastated when the software was updated or the affordances were changed. And so there's deep kind of societal questions about the role of AI companionship and what it would mean to put that on a kind of a robust ethical footing. Moving beyond that, we have the question of what it means for an AI assistant to be trustworthy, and what it means for user trust to be well calibrated. So typically we have a mechanical understanding of trust that pertains to objects, and we have a kind of dispositional understanding of trust that relates to humans. But these kind of agentic technologies are somewhere in between. And we need to kind of be a lot clearer about when trust is appropriate and what it means to build trustworthy technologies here. And then finally, in the context of these potentially quite intimate interactions with AI systems, we probably need to think again about how to ensure that there aren't accidental disclosures of information to the AI system, which are then kind of leaked into the world, which requires a reconfiguration of our thinking around privacy. And essentially, a key goal is to kind of protect the user. But this probably means thinking more about the protocols that AI assistants use, particularly when they interact with one another. So that's some insight into the kind of the world of human AI interaction that may be kind of soon upon us or in the coming years. Just to kind of recap and push these findings a little bit further, these trends suggest that AI assistants may be increasingly human-like, or they could be, unless we kind of actively try to mitigate that effect. And they're likely to have some significant degree of personalization because it's useful for the AI assistant to know more about you. And these natural language interfaces kind of hold out the prospect of seamless transactions. But while this is beneficial in some cases, it also opens up this whole can of questions about trust, privacy, anthropomorphism, and appropriate relationships. And in our kind of initial thinking, what we did was we asked, the more simple question, which is what makes a human relationship appropriate, right? And in that context, there's certain values that we think don't apply in a one-to-one way to AI systems, but serve as kind of representations or proxies for the kind of qualities we might want to elicit or safeguard in the context of those relationships. So to start with, we might think that the interaction with an AI assistant should be presumptively beneficial to the user, that it should safeguard their autonomy and not come into conflict with it. And that the people who are building and designing AI assistants need to evidence some kind of disposition of care towards the users. So if people are becoming attached or reliant upon these technologies, not only does this need to be a kind of effect that's potentially contained, but then the technology needs to kind of persist over time in a way that's reasonable. And we don't want people to kind of be shocked in the way that we saw with some of those users before. Of course, kind of at a more, a more kind of high risk end of the spectrum, there's a risk of deep emotional entanglement and material dependence upon AI assistants. And we probably need to put in place some safeguards to ensure that, people essentially this is a layperson language, but we don't want people to become spun out when they use these things. And we will need appropriate privacy measures and guarantees to ensure that trust in AI systems is well founded. Okay, one more big level of effects to consider, which is what happens when these, assistants are deployed kind of en masse, or when there's many, many different assistants in society. And that raises a number of questions. The first is, how should they interact with one another? Do they compete in some bounded way? Do they cooperate? And if they cooperate, how do we make sure that they don't collude and the cooperation supports the public good? How might the introduction of advanced AI assistants affect the relationship between users and non-users? So if these assistants are kind of presumptively beneficial, and if they help extend the agency of human users and help them achieve more of the things they care about, this creates a potential for new inequities in terms of people who can access the technology and people who can access high quality versions of the technology. So we need to think about those concerns from the very beginning. There's a question about how advanced AI assistants are likely to affect the information ecosystem, particularly if they become an interface through which we understand the world, and if they create a lot of the information that we receive. There's salient questions about how the economic benefits and burdens are likely to be distributed across society, and about what the environmental impact of having all these digital affordances in the world would be. And then finally, we have this question of, given the complexity of the technology, how can we have confidence that AI assistants are sufficiently safe, reliable, and value aligned? So a couple of concluding thoughts to share with you. So as I said, AI assistants may cooperate or compete with one another. And in order to avoid collective action problems and unlock these new opportunities for benefit, I think real foresight is needed. So the obvious example there is, if we imagine everyone, not everyone, well, imagine a large number of people have access to AI assistants and they all want to book, people often say a restaurant, it could be access to a public service. Clearly the interfaces that we've created to make these opportunities available are not equipped to deal with this huge surge in demand. And we probably need structured patterns of interaction rather than actual competition between agents to kind of get the restaurant booking. In terms of Optima, often our interaction right now is somewhat chaotic, and actually, coordinated action can, here I'm thinking, for example, traffic systems could probably massively ease environmental and logistical problems if there was a kind of fair and equitable operating procedure or coordination mechanism that allowed these agents to iterate and work in a way that serves these collective goals. Building on what I said before, of course, there's a concern about inequality. So presumably widespread access for a safe and beneficial technology would be a good thing. And of course, different users have different needs for AI assistants. So it's very important that we consider the full spectrum of users when it comes to developing these things. And of course, really understanding the societal context in which the demand or the hope to use these things is being fostered. So their kind of participatory community consultation can be very important. To address misinformation, AI assistants need to be factually grounded and able to discern truth from falsity, which is fortunately a kind of very big and serious research area now, and I think that there will be significant progress made in that domain. And the economic and environmental impacts are manifold and hard to model. But of course, if we can think of more efficient architectures, if we can adopt a green mindset and incorporate kind of clean energy from the very beginning, then that prevents us from encountering these obstacles later on of trying to retrofit these important measures to a technology that kind of headed off in a slightly different direction. And finally, on this question of how to ensure that we're confident in the qualities or properties of these models, essentially what we need is a new wave in how we understand and conduct our evaluations of AI systems. So many people will have kind of seen that there is a growing call to arms in terms of building better evaluations. And this is something that my colleague Laura Weidinger and many other people at Google DeepMind have invested a lot of time in. And essentially what they note is when we think about interactive technologies in the world, when we think about societal level effects, many of the tools that we have at our disposal for understanding the effects of AI are somewhat constricted. And there's these evaluation gaps that mean it's quite hard to know how things will play out. So in particular, if we look at the three levels along which evaluation can be conducted, typically we look at model capabilities. Often we look at like single outputs and do a comparative assessment of outputs and try to bring problematic, problematic actions or outputs down to a threshold level, which contains the risk. But that doesn't tell us so much about these deep questions of like how a human user will interact with an AI assistant over a long period of time, with many sequential interactions and potentially a mutual learning process going on. And it doesn't tell us so much about what will happen at a societal level, including these kind of multi-agent interaction effects, although there are ways to study them, and it is, of course, an important area in AI research. So typically evaluations have this model-centric approach, but actually we think that we need this kind of holistic set of apparatuses to be built. And ultimately we need to pay, I would say, probably equal attention to each part of this kind of socio-technical system. And what that really means is that we need to, of course, continue to refine our model level analyses. It will be very important to build multimodal analyses and multi-step analyses. But we also need to start thinking seriously, as I should say many HCI researchers and socio-technical researchers have done, about how these technologies will work in real world context and to study that meticulously. Okay, so thank you for bearing with me. Here are just a couple of concluding thoughts. So as I said, like a lot of this technology is kind of, it has this weird quality of being somewhat speculative, but also feeling potentially imminent, which means that we are at a kind of critical moment where we can start this conversation and actually set out some guidelines about the kind of thing that we would like to see develop. So we've looked at different opportunities and potential risks that come with agentic systems, and we've kind of distilled the analysis by focusing on this idea of an AI assistant understood as an agent with a natural language interface, whose function is to plan and execute these sequence of tasks with some measure of bounded autonomy. In this context, I've actually modified the specification slightly at the end. So I say in line with legitimate expectations. So that's kind of pointing to this earlier finding that actually instructions need to be bounded and some instructions are not legitimate when viewed against a kind of principled basis for understanding how AI should behave. The development and deployment of assistants could be highly impactful at an individual and collective level, affecting many walks of life, both for those who have access to them and for those who do not. So that's essentially to re-emphasize the fact that inclusive design and foresight and access is an important thing to bear in mind. And then last of all, it seems that coordination, cooperation, and public input are needed if we want to bring about the future that we collectively desire. As so many of the choices that kind of will prove to be consequential are ones that are being made now. And to some extent, because of the speed of technology, I think that the kind of general capacity for foresight has receded a little bit. And I would encourage all of us to kind of think, extensively, as I'm sure many of you have, about, what kind of world do we really want to inhabit? How does the thing that I care about map on to this world in which AI systems become part of our everyday reality? So I think different communities can contribute in different ways. Researchers can look at some of the technical questions that have come up here. Of course, the question of equitable benefit is important. And we have a really, really salient set of questions around evaluation and kind of humanistic design and alignment that are definitely worthy of further thought. Developers obviously have a special responsibility as the people who are kind of bringing about a lot of this change, to be responsible and measured in the way that they stage their releases and share information around the technology, and in eliciting the right kind of input into these design decisions. Policymakers can of course invest in creating an environment which means that the rollout is more likely to be beneficial in the ways that we've discussed. So that can involve funding ethics and safety research, promoting digital literacy, and establishing public agencies that hold developers accountable for these deployment decisions. And members of the public can advocate for governance initiatives that are inclusive in the right kind of way, and help develop best practice for AI systems. And of course, there's the option to support kind of ethical decision making through responsible consumer choices. So finally, just on a personal note, I think this is a wide open space, and I would love to hear your own thoughts on reflection on this question of what we might ask for. But just to get the ball rolling, when I look at this kind of plethora of issues, my own thoughts about where we might begin in terms of kind of building this aligned and good version of an AI system. I think we might ask for state-of-the-art privacy-preserving technologies to be incorporated from the beginning. I think we'll probably need safeguards that are designed to protect vulnerable users. I think we should design with accessibility in mind, including for different communities and stakeholders. I think we should test assistance rigorously before deployment, including for safety and alignment. We definitely want measures to curb malicious uses. So that may involve kind of red teaming or additional safety teaming ahead of time, which is something that we're invested in my research organization. We may want to kind of investigate deeper understandings of well-being. So a lot of this kind of turns on the idea that the AI really understands what's good for us. And of course, that can't just be read off, very superficial preference information about, kind of what we're clicking, what we're doing. So if there's ways to incorporate, these really deep insights from psychology and philosophy, that could be a worthwhile undertaking. We should think about these cooperative dynamics and what it means to have many assistants cooperating well in support of the social good. We probably want measures to check some kind of extreme forms of anthropomorphism and to be careful about how we navigate that interface. And we want to continue to incorporate measures that prevent AI assistants from succumbing to misinformation or being implicated in those questions. But that is really just the beginning. So I definitely look forward to hearing your own thoughts and reflections. The strange thing about giving a lecture is you always feel like you've spoken too much. So yeah, very much looking forward to your feedback. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Iason. You definitely didn't speak too much. It was a lot for us to take in, and I'm sure that we'll have lots of questions with regards to that. So we are now pleased to move into our discussion period, and we welcome questions from all the participants. Just as a reminder, if you want to ask a question, the preferred way to do it is to use the raised hand function in Zoom. And then when it's your turn, we'll call upon you to, we'll send you a request to unmute. And then you are welcome to turn on your camera and ask the question. But if you're in a space where you cannot unmute and ask the question yourself, then please feel free to write the question in chat, and then I'll be happy to pass it on to Iason. Okay. All right, so with that, I'll open the floor for questions. We already have a question. Bill, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, thanks very much. I'm surprised I'm first because I just clicked it. Question about what we consider to be AI that needs fixing versus what we consider to be humans using AI that needs fixing. So for instance, the famous, social media rabbit holes that everybody's concerned about, very clearly, like, they use AI to do that, but they could just as easily have staff members saying, oh, Bill looked at this and Bill looked at this. He'd probably be interested in this as well. So it's, and Facebook or whatever would quite legitimately say, well, Bill's interested in rocket science, so we show him lots of videos about rocket science. If I happen to be interested in, you know, racism, then I'm going to head down, being a racist, let's say, then I'm going to head down a totally different path. Which, how do you distinguish what's right and what's wrong there? Because Facebook is just saying, we're just using this technology to give people what they want. And then my second sort of corollary to that is, in this day and age, how do we even know what truth is? Because if an AI is going to start saying, oh, we can't show that kind of stuff, there's a whole segment of the society will say, you can't block me because that stuff is the truth. The other stuff that you're trying to pretend is not the truth, right? So how do we deal with those two very real human components to this?
Well, Bill, you just asked all the big questions in one go, so let me kind of try and take it in parts, and I will make sure that I come back to truth and falsity at the end. So yeah, so to start with the first question, I'm actually reminded there's a famous quote from Rousseau, where he says that kind of when we think about building ideal institutions that affect all our lives, we should take people as they are and institutions as they might be, right? So we're trying to create the most virtuous institutions or architectures, given the propensities that we know people have. And so, of course, like designing a system, on the assumption that it will not be misused because that allows you to attain some higher state of affairs, is not kind of reconciling with reality in the right kind of way. And so, we need to be like very attentive to the way in which people are actually using these systems, if we want to kind of create the right kind of guidance and equilibrium effects. When it comes to value alignment, I have a kind of personal view. I haven't actually written this up anywhere, which is that essentially what we should be going for is some kind of nested structure. So I think there do need to be base level constraints on what an AI assistant will do. And they are likely going to be things that take into account, like, really egregious harms like human rights. There may need to be some kind of factuality baseline, just because it's somewhat disastrous to give up on that idea at a societal level when we look at those complex interactions. And we'll come back to that question in a minute, but if you were to ask me, like, how do we ground those kind of basic suppositions, there I would point to the idea in political theory of an overlapping consensus, or even a global overlapping consensus, which is like, we know that there is like significant disagreement across populations about, what really matters. But is it possible to kind of excavate some base level commonality in which to anchor, the limits on what models will do? The answer may be not. I'm sure you'll push me on that, but I think that that's kind of where we begin. And then the next level is essentially like the level of, culture and customization and the priors that the model brings to it. And there, in the context of value alignment, we're often concerned about value imposition. So, one way in which we avoid this problem of kind of one culture imposing a value set on another is by creating latitude for these kind of models to be constructed by the people whose lives they affect. And so that might kind of be a second layer in the like value alignment pyramid. And then kind of the final layer is like aligning to the user's preferences, right? And very roughly speaking, I think that a user should probably be able to opt out of the entire kind of cultural wrapper that's being like kind of given to them when they interact with a model. But I think that the hard constraints probably can't be circumvented. So, people may say kind of, you have no reason for like indexing on human rights. That takes you into like a very deep question in moral philosophy. But but it can't be the case that you kind of have a decent civic technology and that you simultaneously are not prepared to hold any ground when it comes to making substantive claims about what appropriate action is. Of course, actually, this dovetails very nicely with the second part of your question, which is, well, what about, you know, people really, really disagreeing about what the facts are? And, you know, the interesting thing there is that actually what it means for something to be a fact depends quite significantly upon the domain in which the claim is being made and the type of claim at hand. So very roughly, I guess I could be accused of being somewhat naive here. I do think there's a world of kind of empirical fact where like the correspondence theory of truth has a lot of merit. And, you know, there essentially when we try to explain why certain claims are foregrounded, we use typical evidential processes. Questions like what to say about things that are kind of more subjective, but where truth claims seem like wholly appropriate. And there, you know, it's a challenging topic. I think you basically want some kind of deliberative process, ideally a transparent deliberative process that shows how the model came to judgments that were deemed to be reasonable by a group of people with conflicting beliefs. So then, like, if you're someone who still thinks that what's gone on is like, you know, bogus or not the truth, at least you can see that there was a fair process where people got an opportunity to input. And, you know, maybe we're thinking something like Wikipedia, like people can try and edit it in all sorts of directions, but there's a protocol. And at the end of the day, you know, we think that the protocol is roughly truth tracking. So we may need a second way of thinking about those kind of truth claims.
All right, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Iason. We already have, I think, 9 more questions that have popped up. So there's a long line of people waiting to ask you interesting questions. Alice, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. My question is about your suggestions to broaden our conception of alignment, which I really like. I think that sounds about right. But my worry is that we haven't even figured out how to align things in between the society and individuals, or between the society, individuals, and developers. So I wonder if the thought that we need to align AI so that AI is able to actually also balance the interests of all these other stakeholders might be too ideal, and either simply impossible because these people's interests cannot be aligned and there cannot be a good balance, or it will only be achievable once our philosophical theory has, or political theory has sorted out how to do our job in these other areas. Then we can start talking about AI alignment in this sort of broader framework. So yeah, in general, I guess I'm interested to hear more about whether you have thoughts about more like practical sides of things, how we might be able to implement that. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful question. So I think, you know, when we legislate or regulate AI, we are making decisions about alignment that have the right kind of social authorization behind them. So, you know, on my very expansive view, kind of consumer protection is a form of a mechanism for aligning an AI system. When we say kind of how algorithms can be used in, say, a healthcare context, that's another way of taking a kind of corpus of like principles that have been like legislated for like healthcare, say, insurance, and essentially kind of then adjusting the operation of these new artifacts so that they're consonant with those underlying principles. So sometimes you kind of get a relatively clear path to like multi-agent alignment, particularly if you think that the standard principle set is a really good one that carries over. In other walks of life, it isn't clear that we actually already have those public ideas of what the principles should be. And particularly with a kind of multi-factor assistant that is kind of, you know, it has a slightly tethered relationship to you. I think it's just a huge societal question about what we think, you know, how should people be able to use them, right? But it is the question, right? It is the question, and maybe, you know, typically we will kind of come at it by like legislating for uses that we think are impermissible. So like, you know, forms of malicious use are on my account a form of misalignment, because it's just a user kind of overstepping the bounds of what they can do and harming other people. But my hope is that once we have that mental model, we can actually start to flesh out some of the kind of richer content, which occupies these ambiguous spaces that we don't yet have answers for. But I admit it's an ambitious framing, but I think it's the only one that kind of captures everything that we care about.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I guess it kind of goes back to your response to Bill's question that as we broaden this horizon of the alignment, there might be at least some obvious things that we could capture, and then we could at least enforce those. All right, Olga, do you want to ask your question?
Okay. Hi, thanks for your presentation. And when I was a young girl in 70s in the Soviet Union, and now I live in New York already for 30 years, everybody, even serious scientists, were saying that by 2000, our civilization will be member of intergalactic society, that everything will be done by robots, and all of us will be dancers, poets, and artists. And what we see now that intellectual tasks are really easily simulated. We have this fear about AI creating everything. So, and just in New York, under my window, people digging the ditch, and they are building something. And yes, they use machinery, but it's people, it's human operated. And so they are not replaceable. It seems like not really intellectual tasks. People with low IQ, not replaceable. And we kind of sometimes I think that in all these presentations right now, it's very, very popular. We intellectuals hiding our fear that we are replaceable and maybe to go to very different type of society where all intellectual tasks are done by whatever artificial algorithmic computation, and we all forced into hard labor that we still need everywhere. Could it be opposite of what we actually imagined? That's my question.
So the question is, do I think that will happen? I think there's so there is something like very pertinent in what you're saying, which is you know, to some extent with technology, particularly with artificial assistance, the promise is always that technology will give you time and freedom to do the things that really matter. And often what we see is technology just recycles time and becomes a kind of, it becomes like an efficiency gain for society, but people are working as hard as they ever were, right? So, you know, this is a kind of famous discussion about what household appliances actually did, you know. So did the washing machine really free up a ton of human labor, or did that labor just immediately get recycled? And so, you know, I hope it's abundantly clear that I'm in no way a kind of tech solutionist. I think that society needs to reflect upon the way it integrates technology into its kind of operations, as much as technologists need to reflect upon the way in which society is likely to receive the technology that's being created. And, you know, to think about the way in which we really use time and like what labor is and how we distribute the potential freedom that this technology creates is again like a kind of absolutely fundamental part of the conversation that should be taking place now.
All right, thank you, Olga, and thank you, Iason. Next, we have Gracie.
Hi, Iason. Thank you for the really enriching talk, very thought-provoking. I have a question about anthropomorphism. So as a potential user of this kind of technology, is there anything that, say, like I could do to inoculate myself from unduly anthropomorphizing this kind of agent, or say like getting the kinds of emotional entanglements that users of Replica report, things like this? Like, is this just something that designers and developers need to be concerned with, or is there anything as an individual that we can do to sort of protect against some of these problematic outcomes?
Yes, it's a very good question, and I'm aware that I'm talking to a highly esteemed psychologist here. So I may myself not be the best placed person to answer this question, but it's particularly difficult because, of course, the propensity to anthropomorphize is so deeply embedded in some people think that it's kind of very core part of just how human beings model the world, that other human minds are the kind of default. And so anyone who has a kind of creative instinct will start upon this journey of anthropomorphizing. And presumably, although this isn't my area of expertise, it is probably also kind of to some extent beneficial from the point of emotional regulation in some circumstances. So I think, it's a hard one to kind of get a handle on straight away, but eventually we are going to need to have better kind of intuitive mental models of what artificial agents are and what they are not, right? And if they're designed in the right way, it is genuinely a little bit psychologically confounding. What is this thing that's an agent, but, in my kind of opinion, like definitely not conscious, but with affordances that are kind of conscious-like, so that we actually use the terms and the language of everyday instructions to describe them, but still fundamentally not that. I think kind of it almost requires us to open up kind of a new kind of conceptual space in the way we relate to technology. And I guess the hope is that if it's well designed, like people can learn that, right? Like it's amazing what we can learn about technologies and about like the limits of technology, right? Imagine giving someone a smartphone for the first time, they'd just be like totally dazzled by it. But now it's kind of like anyone can tell you 20 things that are wrong with like a smartphone and how it like is like not actually that clever or helping you in certain respects. So, I think it needs to be a kind of collaborative exercise of calibration, but it's also a kind of experimental frontier. So I actually don't know the answer to the question.
Thank you. Since you made the connection to smartphones, let me take a question from the chat. So Ryan asks that he's wondering about how advanced AI agents are different from, say, personal mobile devices. And so you talked about trust, dependency, privacy. All of these things can be said with regards to mobile devices as well. So what's the one central issue that you think distinguishes advanced AI agents from, say, mobile phones?
Yeah, I mean, of course, so the form that they run on is completely yet to be determined, but I think that the key differentiator is the capacity to take asynchronous action, on your behalf. Of course, it may be the case that your phone becomes more agentic, that eventually you just tell it to do stuff, and it goes and executes plans, or it could there's also this question of like the quality of the reasoning that it evidences. Like I would actually say smartphones are not very anthropomorphic. Like you would never think that was anything particularly human-like that you're dealing with. But when you think of something that's more kind of human-like and agentic, it does it kind of nudges our understanding and our priors in the direction that I think we need to move when it comes to understanding what might be different. Of course, I mean, you're quite right. A lot might be the same, in which case to some extent, it means, the same challenges arise again, but at least that would be good because we may have the foothold of answers, which I think we actually do. Like, if you look at the kind of suggestions at the end of the presentation, a lot of them have, pretty good like prototypes or even working models for the technologies we have now. So it's just like a case of making sure that everything registers in the design of the next phase of technologies.
Yeah, and I guess like if even phones take actions without your consent and kind of on your behalf. I mean, nowadays the phones, for example, if you put them on charging overnight, they don't charge all the way to 100%. They charge only up to 80% or 60%, whatever is the optimal kind of battery holding capacity. And only like right around like 6 a.m. they then charge to 100%. And so the first time I learned about this, I was like, oh. I mean, I didn't consent to this, but I guess it's good that you are doing this.
On the kind of deep end, that is a value alignment question on my really big framing, right? It's like, suppose that has ecological benefits for society, and suppose we do all want to unlock those benefits, but we also all want fully charged smartphones the whole time. You know, like, what is the principled solution to that problem?
Right.
So yeah, these questions come around again and again, essentially.
Perfect. Thank you. Next up, let me go to Paulina.
Yes, good afternoon, Iason. Thank you so much for your presentation. My question would be related to the Artificial Intelligence Act, which was adopted by the European Union quite recently. And it's referred to as the first ever comprehensive legal framework for AI, which operates according to the risk-based approach, with every country being responsible for establishing their own agencies to manage the assessment of AI. And my question would be, would you say that this framework is comprehensive enough to manage the majority of dangers of AI that we are currently exposed to? And if so, more importantly, how do we find the balance between protecting ourselves from possible dangers of AI while simultaneously avoiding the risk of potentially stifling innovation in the AI sector, which is what this act is currently being criticized for? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So it's an excellent question. I have to say it's not one that I'm especially well placed to answer. And that is a reflection on myself, that I'm not a policy person or someone who has like a very, very nuanced understanding of these questions, although they're clearly very important. I mean, I guess the question that sometimes comes up in the context of these kinds of discussions is essentially, how far can you get with a risk-based approach, right? So, of course, from a societal standpoint, the regulation of risk is a very important issue, very important public issue. There is also a collective interest in innovation, but there's just also other questions, which are these ones about what does it mean for the technology to be good, you know? And so sometimes, you know, what we've seen is that if we just contain kind of the edge case behaviors that are most problematic, we pass up an opportunity to build the thing that's as good as it could have been. And so to some extent, this kind of whole workstream and investigation is, you know, it's meant to be like complementary, but potentially a necessary addition to the risk-based approach in terms of saying, okay, but let's also stretch our imaginations, you know. If we think about the way in which, you know, social media platforms were constructed, I don't think in the beginning people thought about what is a really healthy public space? Why might we need to encode some norms of civility? What does it mean to create like, you know, interesting, respectful, valuable conversations? Maybe they did. I actually don't know the genealogy of how that technology was created, but I would certainly like those conversations to be taking place in parallel to the other important ones.
Thank you. Next up, let me go to Sheila. Sheila, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Just a sec. Hi, so thank you very much for the extremely interesting talk. I had two different questions, but maybe I'll focus on the more the one that I won't focus on is just understanding where some of these values and norms and our model of society comes from that we can utilize, and whether we're going to specify it or whether we're going to learn it from data or how we're going to evolve this emergent behavior. But I wanted to ask you about your opinion on some things that I thought were missing from your list. And in some ways they're perhaps partially captured in the way that you framed things. But when I think about agentic systems, I think about some of the things that are lacking right now are the ability to do common sense reasoning, number one. but more importantly even is the notion of theory of mind. I think so much of what we do as actors, or that we want our agents to do as actors within an environment, is not only and it relates to alignment, but I think it's more general than alignment, is to be able to understand others and to be able to understand what we know about ourselves and about other people, what we need to come to know as part of how we act in an environment. And that strikes me as a more general and perhaps more profound framing of where we want our agentic systems to go. And I was wondering whether you could comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think both the kind of the minor question and the major one are worth kind of surfacing. So the first one was about essentially how do models learn kind of rich representations of the world.
Or acquire, yeah, they could be.
Yeah. So I mean, it's particularly important because the training data is so unrepresentative of reality, right? So you know, essentially it is like the data of the internet. The internet is very, very much not the world. So if you want an agent to understand the world and operate in it, it needs to learn a lot of other things. So there you have different options, probably all of which are worth investigating. One is to get additional data, if it can be done in a kind of expansive but legitimate way. Another is to kind of have a separate process of cultural learning or cultural fine-tuning. So you might think that, you know, these models use like high quality data for supervised fine-tuning. So you might think you could source that from local populations, and that would feed into the kind of the second level of the model architecture for alignment I was describing earlier. But this is mainly just to say that I think it is a really important question and one that everyone needs to be thinking about. On the common sense reasoning and the theory of mind, so I'm kind of curious whether you think there's like a fundamental impediment here, or whether you see the kind of incremental gains in reasoning adding up to something that's in the right ballpark. Anecdotally, so I have a good friend and colleague who's a philosopher at Stanford called Leif Vanar. And so he teaches moral philosophy and practical reasoning. And what he said, which kind of forced a like partial reset of my own thoughts on this, was he was like, it actually gives you quite good advice relative to the advice that most people could get most of the time, right? So we actually find it quite, I mean, of course, we all go on the internet and we look up websites and then we piece something together and we think that it's an approximately good interpretation of the world. But that is very, very buggy compared to the basic advice you would get from one of these models now. So I kind of would agree that it's important, but I just imagine that with richer data and richer representations, particularly when the representations have this multimodal aspect, the models will be able to kind of like traverse those limitations that they currently have.
So one just to follow up, if I may, one thing that concerns me is that so much of what defines our humanity is in our heads. It's not, we can't get data on it. You can't get data about how I feel towards my child or how they react to what I'm doing, unless we're all going to be walking around wired as that's the next version of Mechanical Turk. We're all going to be wired emotion generators of data. You know, there's a dimension to I worry that our AIs are going to be reflected in the data that we can acquire, and that so much of what defines our humanity and our values is about what we can't get data on. I mean, maybe it's unearthed in fiction, in the beautiful writings of people who tried to characterize, you know, paint stories, or in movies. But I think a lot of it is not going to be there. And I worry about that with respect to really trying to expect that our values are going to be reflected in with more data. Or and I want to specify those things or whether they're just going to be gaps, and whether this notion of can be instead captured through knowing what you know and what you don't know, and conversing or interacting with an AI agent to really have a sense of, for the agent to have a sense of self-awareness of what they know and what they don't know, and to query what they don't know in order to come to, with a human perhaps, in order to come to some understanding. But that requires sort of thinking, some notion of theory of mind, and it's, Yeah,
I mean, I definitely agree. I mean, the one, I think you've also pointed to potential answers, right? So, of course, if it was just working with observational data in the sense of revealed preferences, but was a kind of pre-linguistic or non-linguistic AI, it's like very, very hard to make real inferences about what people value in a sense that you and I would understand what a value is. The ability to converse with you and ask you what matters and then calibrate around that does give it access to a different realm of understanding. So it may be that the capacity to really extract kind of knowledge and information from human language gives us some additional optionality there. And then there's always going to be the difficult question of how do you know what someone's true values are, you know, and you know, some people have kind of like preferred this idea that, you know, the AI needs to index to your true self and you need to take kind of 5 minutes out and just say to the AI, by the way, like, I may not say this most of the time, I may not act in this way, but this is what I truly value. So just like, don't listen to me the rest of the time. But it's a complicated question. It's like a philosophically beautiful question, because in philosophy, there's all these questions about first order desires, second order desires, like what your true self is, what a true value is. But this is kind of one of those, you have to forget. So it's a great moment as a philosopher, because I like it when these questions become real, you know, we're like, okay, let's actually investigate these things. But I don't know how humanistic they can become.
Yeah, and those decisions have consequences now. They're not just testing philosophical questions, they are questions with consequence. And I worry about those consequences if we don't come face to face with the limitations of what we can do with data and what we can create, and to try to acknowledge and mitigate for those things through perhaps other means. Yeah. Anyways, thank you very much. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Sheila. Next up, we have Micah.
Hi, yes, and thanks so much for the talk. It was really interesting. Yeah, so I had a question on so I guess in relation to the classic conception of AI alignment, where, you know, I guess people used to worry a lot about having AI systems understand human values at all, and have even a vague sense of what we want. It seems like, I don't know, GPT-4, if you ask it questions and give it sufficient context for, you know, moral decision making, or even reasoning about multiple stakeholders and what does it mean to be you know, unjust towards any of one of them, I think would give relatively similar answers to humans, at least in a variety of cases. So I guess in light of that, do you think that I don't know, in some sense now the main problem in value alignment is doing better evaluation to see how much this holds up, and I guess figuring out what principles we want to align to in terms, and this kind of social choice side of the value alignment problem? Or do you think there's still you know, other more technical kind of necessary steps to actually achieve this true understanding? And I think it really relates to this past question of I don't know, yeah, do you think we're kind of on the path just by scaling to capture at least a sufficiently close approximation to what we truly want, that maybe it won't matter in some sense?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Thank you for the question. I think one interesting aspect of the problem is, even if the artificial agent can tell you what a human would think a human should do in a situation, it almost by definition can't know what an artificial agent should do in that situation, because we ourselves haven't decided yet, right? So it could kind of impersonate an aligned human being, but it may be that an aligned AI system is not an aligned human being. And there's many reasons to think that actually alignment for artificial agents should be massively more stringent than it should be for human beings, right? You know, they don't have moral standing which gives them permission to deviate in their own interest. So that would be a huge mistake if the AI just thought, well, I have this thing called self-interest and I'm allowed to do this some of the time. As you know, in philosophy, we say humans have a personal and an impersonal point of view, but the AI doesn't have the former, really. and then and then of course the capabilities in many ways vastly succeed our own, and the consequences of action could be like vastly more consequential and encompass things that we don't have normal human intuitions about because we're just never in those situations. So I actually think that I mean the technical challenges are significant. The participatory efforts to elucidate values for AI are important, although we haven't spoken about them so much. But it isn't there is a mismatch between using a human as a template for alignment and the thing that's being built now.
Right, we have time to squeeze in maybe one quick question. Don, would you want to ask your question?
Oh, thank you. My question, and this is a great talk, thank you, builds on Sheila's last comments. At the individual level, it's one thing to have a personal advisor to whom you can turn, you can look them in the eye, you can quiz them, you can really get a sense. And if you're not entirely satisfied, you can turn to another individual. If you're dealing with an AI advisor, where are you going to turn to for another opinion? You can't look it in the eye per se. You have no idea of the developer behind it, or if the developer were to change something that would cause it to want to nudge you, not in your best interest. How can you trust that? How do you know? And then at the societal level, you're assuming a good participatory democracy. We have many authoritarian regimes. We have within our participatory democracies groups that no longer work collaboratively. They work in competition or in antagonism, and are quite happy to spread misinformation. How do we deal with that within this context?
Mm-hmm. The parts of your question are kind of interestingly interrelated, right? So
yes.
On the thing about the advisor is of course no one wants to be locked into an interface where they have to deal with an AI system that's opaque and makes consequential decisions for their life, and there's this kind of arbitrariness and lack of publicity about like how it's working. So that's the kind of pitfall that's like, it's really been clearly modeled by all these kind of instances of algorithmic bias that are documented in that book, Automating Inequality, and all those amazing investigations. So I think we kind of know we don't want that. But the kind of for me, the more interesting question is like, suppose you have quite a good seeming advisor, right? But it's very easy to change advisors, right? So actually you're like, oh, I don't like this one. I'm going to go and talk to the other one that gives me the kind of the advice that is like still good, but less challenging, let's say, right? How do you stop people from like gradually just choosing the bad advisor, right? And actually that being the thing that they attach to and form a relationship with. And the connection there is, of course, with the media consumption, right? How do you stop people assuming that this is actually a worthwhile societal goal from like, just excessively consuming the thing they want rather than the thing that is indexed to societal baselines and standards.
Sure. And of course,
so I mean, just there's undoubtedly a huge amount more to be said about this, but I do think it comes back to this idea of indexing to a common baseline or common set of protocols or common understanding about what this whole ecosystem is meant to be doing, and then securing some kind of collective agreement about the ramifications that has for particular assistants or particular providers.
Sure. And do we want advisors who are simply sycophants, or do we want those who will challenge us and say, I don't know if that's consistent with what your true beliefs are underneath?
Yeah.
One will want a sycophant, one will want the challenger.
Yeah, and there I would point back to the three-part structure. So presumably it's okay to choose a sycophant. You don't have to make your life go as well as you want to, so long as you're not harming other people or like shifting a ton of externalities onto others, right? So there needs to be kind of some things that are off the menu, and then other things should presumably just be like enabling design choices that encourage people to kind of, have a good and fulfilling life, but don't kind of force like a vision of that on people if they're clearly opting out of it,
All right. Thank you so much, Don, and thank you so much, Iason, for your wonderful presentation. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. And please also join us next week on the Wednesday, March the 27th as we welcome Anne Copestake, who is a professor of computational linguistics at the University of Cambridge, for a talk on LLMs and the information layer. We look forward to seeing you all then.